Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 3, The Politics of Legitimacy, June 30th, 2026, Chapter 11, States Built Upon Compliance. Every modern state, regardless of its form of government, makes a claim that would have been unthinkable to most rulers throughout history, that its authority derives from the consent of the governed. Monarchies claimed divine right, empires claimed conquest. The modern state, almost without exception, claims something else entirely, that the people subject to its laws have, in some meaningful sense, agreed to be subject to them. This is among the more remarkable rhetorical achievements in the history of political organization, and it deserves to be examined with the same rigor applied to religion's covenant claim in Part 2, because the structural parallel is exact. The state inherited covenant's vocabulary, the social contract, government by consent, the will of the people, without inheriting the theological rigor that vocabulary was built to enforce. What remains, in the overwhelming majority of cases examined honestly against the sovereignty test of Chapter 4, is consent in name, compliance in structure, and an apparatus of ritual, proxy, and manufactured deference sophisticated enough to make the substitution largely invisible to the population living inside it. The social contract's quiet admission. It is worth noting, before going further, that the philosophical tradition most responsible for popularizing the idea of government by consent was remarkably honest about a problem this book has named repeatedly. The contract in question was never actually signed by anyone. Social contract theory, in its classical formulations, does not point to an actual historical document, an actual moment of collective agreement, an actual population that gathered and consented to the terms of its own governance. It points instead to a hypothetical what rational people would agree to under conditions of fairness the theorist constructs for the purpose of the argument. This is intellectually serious work, and it produced genuine insight into what legitimate governance would require. But it is worth being precise about what kind of claim it actually is. Not a historical account of consent given, but a normative argument about consent that should, in principle, be obtainable, used retroactively to justify authority over populations who were never asked anything at all. The slippage from consent that would be rational to consent that has therefore effectively occurred is one of the most consequential moves in the history of political philosophy, and it recurs throughout this chapter in less abstract, more concrete forms. The citizen born into a state is held to have tacitly consented to its authority by the mere fact of continued residence, an argument structurally identical to the proxy consent mechanisms examined in Chapter 8, substituting a hypothetical agreement for an actual one and then treating the substitution as settled. Tacit consent and the exit cost test. Tacit consent deserves particular scrutiny here because it is the mechanism doing the heaviest lifting in nearly every modern state's claim to govern legitimately, and because it fails Chapter 2's exit cost test about as completely as any mechanism examined in this book. The argument runs as follows. A person who continues to reside within a state's territory, accepts its protections, uses its currency, and does not emigrate has, by virtue of these continued actions, tacitly consented to its authority. The argument has a certain surface plausibility. Continued participation does suggest something. But examine it against the three tests developed in Chapter 2. The exit cost test asks what refusal, in this case emigration or some other form of withdrawal from the state's claimed authority, would actually cost the person making the choice. For the overwhelming majority of people in the overwhelming majority of states throughout history, the answer is catastrophic: loss of language community, family, employment, legal status, accumulated social capital, and frequently the financial resources required to relocate at all. An argument that treats failure to incur catastrophic cost as equivalent to affirmative agreement is not describing consent. It is describing the absence of a viable alternative, dressed in consent's vocabulary. The alternatives test asks whether genuine alternatives were actually available. For most of human history, and for a great many people today, the realistic alternative to the state one is born into is not a different state freely chosen from a menu of comparably accessible options. It is statelessness, or a different state with its own entry barriers, often more restrictive than the one being notionally exited, and itself subject to the identical tacit consent argument the moment entry is achieved. The menu, examined honestly, is not a menu of free choices. It is a closed system in which every available option makes the identical retroactive claim to one's consent. The authorship test asks whether a single identifiable party can be held accountable for the architecture producing this outcome, or whether authorship has been diffused beyond any actionable point. The international system of states, each independently legitimate by the same tacit consent logic, each controlling its own borders, produces exactly the diffused architecture Chapter 2 identified as coercion's most durable modern form. No single state can be blamed for the global absence of a genuinely consensual alternative, because each state, examined individually, is merely exercising its own sovereign right to control entry, the same diffusion of authorship that allowed Chapter 2's landlords, employers, and credentialing boards to produce collectively coercive outcomes without any individual actor bearing individual responsibility for the whole. Birth as the original non-consensual event. Beneath tacit consent lies a still more fundamental problem this chapter should name directly rather than circle around. The relationship between a state and the overwhelming majority of its citizens begins at a moment birth, at which the sovereignty test of Chapter 4 cannot possibly be satisfied, because the party being bound possesses none of the three required capacities. No infant has the capacity to know what citizenship entails. No infant has the capacity to refuse it. No infant can be meaningfully recognized as a sovereign party whose dissent would alter the outcome. This is structurally identical to the infant baptism problem examined in Chapter 6, and the state's solution to it is structurally identical to the religious solution. Defer the question of genuine consent to a later moment, when the now-grown citizens' continued residence, voting, tax payment, and general participation are treated as a kind of secular confirmation, ratification after the fact, of a status that was assigned long before consent was possible. The problem, again, is not the deferral mechanism itself, which may be the only practical solution available to a genuine and unavoidable problem. States, like religious communities, must find some way to extend membership to people who cannot yet consent to it. The problem is what Chapter 7 identified in ritual and Chapter 8 identified in proxy authority. The deferred moment of genuine ratification, when it finally arrives, almost never occurs under conditions that actually satisfy the sovereignty test. The adult citizen asked to ratify citizenship through continued participation is by then embedded in exactly the total social, economic, and legal dependency that makes refusal catastrophically costly, the same embeddedness marker Chapter 7 identified as disqualifying confirmation from counting as genuine adult consent. What compliance actually measures? If tacit consent does not measure consent, what does the extraordinarily high rate of civic compliance observed across nearly every modern state actually demonstrate? It demonstrates, most parsimoniously, what Chapter 5 argued any high compliance, low refusal environment demonstrates. Not that the underlying arrangement was freely chosen, but that the cost of refusing it has been engineered, across generations of institutional development, to exceed what nearly anyone is willing to pay. This is not a claim that every law is illegitimate or that every citizen secretly wishes to renounce their citizenship. Many genuinely do not. Some portion of civic compliance reflects genuine endorsement, freely arrived at, of arrangement citizens would choose even given costless alternatives. And where this is true, the sovereignty test is satisfied and the state's claim to legitimate authority over that citizen is sound. The argument this chapter advances is narrower and, by now, familiar in its shape. Civilization has built an entire apparatus of political legitimacy on a foundation: tacit consent, birth-assigned membership, retroactive ratification through compliance, that cannot, by its own internal logic, distinguish genuine endorsement from engineered acquiescence. The state has never needed to make this distinction, because compliance has always been sufficient for its purposes regardless of what produced it. Chapter 12 turns to the machinery developed specifically to manufacture that compliance at scale, long before the tools of mass media made manufacturing consent an explicit, professionalized discipline, and to the older, less visible administrative architecture that performed the same function under the name of nothing more dramatic than bureaucracy. Chapter 12. Manufactured consent before television. It is tempting to treat the manufacture of political consent as a distinctly modern phenomenon, a product of mass media, broadcast technology, and the 20th century's discovery of psychological persuasion at industrial scale. This temptation should be resisted. The mechanisms examined in this chapter predate the printing press, let alone the television set, and recognizing their age matters for the argument this book is building. What changed with each new communications technology was never the underlying mechanism, only its reach, its speed, and the size of the population a single act of manufacture could now touch simultaneously. The ancient machinery. Every durable political order in recorded history developed techniques for producing the appearance of popular endorsement that exceeded the actual depth of popular conviction, and the techniques cluster around a small number of recurring forms. Ceremonial acclamation, the assembled crowd, the shouted approval, the public ritual of a ruler's elevation witnessed and affirmed by a gathered populace, performed for ancient and medieval polities much of the evidentiary function Chapter 7 assigned to religious ritual. It generated a record, a memory, a story the participants would go on to tell, regardless of how genuinely free the assembled crowd had been to withhold its acclamation. Roman emperors were acclaimed by armies whose continued pay depended on the acclamation occurring. Medieval coronations were affirmed by assemblies whose attendance was itself a matter of feudal obligation rather than independent civic choice. The acclamation looked to any observer and frequently to the participants themselves, like spontaneous popular endorsement. Its actual conditions, examined against Chapter 4's sovereignty test, looked considerably more like the embeddedness and exit cost failures examined throughout Parts 1 and 2. Official historiography performed a complementary function, operating not on the moment of consent but on its memory afterward. Court chroniclers, commissioned scribes, and state-sponsored historical narrative consistently performed the same retroactive service Chapter 7 identified in ritual generally, converting whatever had actually occurred, conquest, succession dispute, palace intrigue, into a narrative of legitimate, broadly endorsed transition, available for later citation as established historical fact precisely because the population capable of contesting the narrative in real time rarely possessed the literacy, the platform, or the survivable opportunity to do so. Public works and ceremonial architecture supplied a third, more durable mechanism. Monuments, temples, triumphal arches, and grand civic construction projects that did not argue for a ruler's legitimacy so much as assume it, embedding the assumption into the physical landscape a population would move through daily for generations, long after the actual circumstances of acquisition had been replaced in collective memory by the monument's silent, continuous assertion that things had always been thus and were therefore presumably right to be thus. None of these mechanisms required mass communication technology. They required only sufficient control over the available channels of memory, narrative, and physical environment, control that, in any given era, was always available to whoever already held power, which is precisely the diffused, self-reinforcing architecture examined throughout this book. Those most able to manufacture the appearance of consent were always, not coincidentally, those least in need of obtaining it genuinely. What changed and what didn't? The arrival of print and later mass broadcast media did not introduce the manufacture of consent into political life. It introduced scale, speed, and, crucially, a new degree of deniability, because mass media could manufacture belief across an entire population without any single locatable act of coercion or fraud occurring against any single locatable individual. This is worth dwelling on, because it represents the political analog of the diffused authorship Chapter 2 identified in economic coercion and Chapter 3 identified in manufactured belief. A medieval ruler manufacturing acclamation needed an actual assembled crowd, an actual army, an actual chronicler, discrete, locatable instruments whose coercive or compliant function could, at least in principle, be examined and named. A 20th century state manufacturing consent through mass broadcast media needed no comparably locatable instrument. It needed only a sufficiently saturated information environment, repeated with sufficient consistency across enough independently operating channels, that the desired belief would emerge as something the population experienced as self-generated common sense rather than as anything that had been done to them. This is precisely the mechanism named in Chapter 3 under Bernays' own preferred vocabulary, engineering of consent, and political authority adopted it with at least as much enthusiasm as commercial advertising did, for an obvious reason. A state capable of manufacturing the belief that its authority is legitimate and broadly endorsed never needs to address the harder, more dangerous underlying question of whether that authority would survive a genuinely free test of the sovereignty. Conditions examined throughout this book. Manufactured belief is simply cheaper than genuine consent, and political authority has never required a special incentive to prefer the cheaper option once the cheaper option became technically available. Wartime propaganda and the birth of the discipline. The early 20th century deserves particular attention here because it marks the moment political consent manufacture stopped being an ad hoc accumulation of techniques and became, explicitly, a studied discipline with its own professional class, its own institutional infrastructure, and its own theoretical literature. Government propaganda efforts during the First World War, developed across multiple combatant nations, demonstrated something that would permanently change the relationship between states and the populations they governed. A sufficiently coordinated information campaign, deployed across newspapers, film, public lectures, and civic organizing, could shift a population from ambivalence or outright opposition to enthusiastic, voluntary feeling support for outcomes, mass conscription, sustained sacrifice, prolonged warfare, that would have been difficult or impossible to extract through coercion alone, at the scale and duration required. What made this development consequential beyond its immediate wartime application was the discovery, articulated explicitly by the practitioners themselves in the years that followed, that the techniques developed for wartime mobilization translated directly into peacetime governance and commercial life. The same psychological mechanisms that could manufacture enthusiasm for a war could manufacture enthusiasm for a candidate, a policy, a product, or, most relevant to this chapter, for the basic legitimacy of the political and economic order doing the manufacturing. Once this transferability was recognized and professionalized, the manufacture of political consent ceased to be something practiced occasionally, in moments of acute crisis, and became something practiced continuously, as an ordinary background condition of modern political life, indistinguishable in its texture from genuine public discourse precisely because that indistinguishability had become the explicit design objective. Why pre-modern manufacture matters for the argument. This chapter's deliberate emphasis on pre-television, pre-broadcast mechanisms serves a purpose beyond historical completeness. It forecloses a comfortable but mistaken response available to any reader inclined to treat manufactured political consent as a problem confined to a particular technological era, broadcast media, social media, whichever platform currently occupies public anxiety, and therefore solvable through better regulation of that specific technology. The mechanism this book is tracing is older than any particular technology and will outlast every particular technology examined in this book, including the artificial intelligence systems discussed in Part 7. What changes across eras is reach and deniability. What does not change is the underlying structure identified across Parts 1 and 2. An institution seeking the appearance of consent without the burden of meeting the actual sovereignty conditions required to earn it genuinely, adapting whatever instruments, acclamation, chronicle, monument, newspaper, broadcast, platform, algorithm, happen to be available in its particular century. This matters directly for this book's eventual argument about artificial intelligence as forensic auditor. A system capable of reconstructing the actual conditions under which political consent was produced, independent of which specific technology was used to produce it, does not need a separate theory for each era's preferred instrument. It needs only the framework this book has been building since Chapter 1. Was the population capable of knowing, capable of refusing, and genuinely recognized as a sovereign party whose refusal would have mattered? Apply that question to a Roman acclamation, a medieval chronicle, a wartime propaganda campaign, or a contemporary social media information environment, and the same underlying architecture becomes visible in every case, wearing whatever century's particular costume happened to be available. The next chapter turns to the machinery that operates continuously between these dramatic episodes of acclamation and propaganda, the unglamorous, procedural, paperwork-driven apparatus of ordinary bureaucracy, and the way bureaucratic ritual performs, in the quiet daily texture of administered life, exactly the consent manufacturing function that acclamation and propaganda perform in their more visible, occasional forms. Chapter 13. Bureaucracy as Ritual. Acclamation and propaganda, examined in the previous chapter, are occasional instruments, deployed at moments of acute political consequence, visible enough to be remembered as events. Bureaucracy operates differently, and for that reason has received far less scrutiny as a mechanism of manufactured consent, despite producing, in aggregate, a volume of consent manufacturing activity that almost certainly exceeds every dramatic episode examined so far in this book combined. Bureaucracy does not announce itself as a persuasion campaign. It presents itself as neutral administration, forms, procedures, stamps, signatures, the unglamorous machinery of a functioning state. This presentation is precisely what makes it so effective, and so rarely examined through the framework this book has been building. The form as ritual. Recall Chapter 7's definition of ritual without sovereignty. A ceremony that generates the evidence of a free choice the surrounding conditions did not actually allow to occur. The bureaucratic form performs this exact function, stripped of ritual's emotional architecture but retaining, and in some respects intensifying, its evidentiary function. Consider the structure of an ordinary administrative transaction, a license application, a benefits enrollment, a regulatory filing, a permit request. The applicant is presented with a document specifying terms, often in technical or legal language exceeding ordinary comprehension, covering obligations, conditions, and waivers the applicant rarely has the time, expertise, or institutional standing to fully evaluate. A signature is requested. The signature is obtained. The transaction is filed, and from that moment forward, the bureaucratic record treats the matter as settled. Terms were presented, terms were agreed to, the file is complete. This is the contract versus covenant distinction from Chapter 1, replicated at industrial scale millions of times daily, across every modern state. And it fails the same sovereignty test in the same structural way. The capacity to know is routinely undermined by documents written in registers specifically unsuited to genuine comprehension by the population required to sign them, not necessarily through deliberate obscurantism, though that occurs too, but through the simple accumulated complexity of regulatory systems built incrementally over decades by specialists who long ago lost the capacity to perceive their own jargon as jargon. The capacity to refuse is routinely undermined by the simple fact that the bureaucratic transaction in question, a permit, a benefit, a license, a registration, is frequently the only available path to something the applicant genuinely needs, with no comparable alternative available outside the bureaucracy's own jurisdiction. And the capacity to be recognized is undermined most completely of all, because bureaucratic process by its very design treats the applicant not as a sovereign party whose objection would alter the outcome, but as a case to be processed according to predetermined criteria the applicant's individual circumstances were never actually positioned to influence. Procedure as anesthesia. Chapter 7 identified ritual's capacity to function as psychological anesthesia, producing genuine emotional states that get mistaken for evidence of free choice, when the emotional state and the freedom of the underlying choice are in fact independent of one another. Bureaucratic procedure performs an analogous function through an entirely different emotional register. Not transcendence, but exhaustion, tedium, and the simple psychological relief of completion. Anyone who has navigated an extended bureaucratic process, the accumulation of required documents, the sequential approvals, the waiting periods, the repeated submissions of information already submitted elsewhere within the same system, recognizes the particular feeling that arrives at the moment of final completion. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of relief indistinguishable, in its felt texture, from satisfaction. This feeling is frequently mistaken, by the person experiencing it, for evidence that the underlying arrangement was something they actually wanted, when it may in fact be nothing more than the relief of escaping a process that had become its own form of cost, a process whose difficulty functioned, whether by design or by the simple accumulated inertia of institutional growth, as exactly the kind of friction Chapter 5 identified as the modern substitute for an outright denial of the right to refuse. This generates a particular and underexamined form of manufactured consent. An applicant who has endured a sufficiently arduous bureaucratic process to obtain something will frequently defend the legitimacy of the process itself, having invested enough effort into completing it that acknowledging its illegitimacy would require acknowledging the effort was wasted, a psychological dynamic separate from, but structurally compounding, every mechanism examined so far in this book. The invisible author. Bureaucracy's most significant contribution to the architecture of manufactured consent is the one this book has named in nearly every chapter so far: the diffusion of authorship past the point of any locatable accountability. A bureaucratic system is, definitionally, not the product of any single decision-maker's will. It accumulates across decades through countless individual regulations, each one passed by a different official or legislature, each one responding to a specific and often genuinely reasonable problem at the time of its adoption, each one adding its own increment of required documentation, required approval, required waiting period. No single architect designed the resulting system. No single official can be held accountable for its cumulative weight. And yet the cumulative weight is real, experienced daily by populations navigating it, producing exactly the structural duress examined in Chapter 2, coercion with no locatable coercer, an architecture everyone participates in constructing and no one individually controls. This diffusion serves bureaucracy's consent manufacturing function in a particularly durable way. It forecloses, almost entirely, the possibility of meaningful contestation. A citizen frustrated by a coercive employer can, at least in principle, identify the employer as the source of the coercion. A citizen frustrated by an accumulated regulatory burden built across decades by hundreds of independent actors has no comparable target. The frustration has nowhere to land except on the system in the abstract. A phrase that, by its very abstraction, drains the frustration of the political force a more locatable grievance would carry, and converts what might otherwise be a genuine challenge to institutional legitimacy into a diffuse, depoliticized irritation directed at nothing in particular and therefore actionable against nothing in particular. Bureaucracy's genuine function, and where it drifts. As with every mechanism examined in this book, the argument here is not that bureaucratic process is inherently illegitimate. Administrative procedure exists for genuine reasons: consistency across cases, protection against arbitrary individual discretion, accumulated institutional knowledge about how particular harms have historically occurred and how they might be prevented, a permitting process that prevents unsafe construction, a regulatory filing that prevents fraudulent financial activity, a benefits enrollment process that verifies genuine eligibility before distributing finite public resources. Each of these serves a legitimate purpose the absence of any procedure at all would fail to serve. The drift this chapter names occurs when procedure, originally adopted to serve a specific, identifiable, defensible purpose, accumulates past the point where any individual component can still be justified against that original purpose, while the system as a whole continues to be defended by the institutions administering it, using the legitimacy of its earliest, most defensible components. A regulatory system can begin with genuinely necessary consumer protections and, across decades of incremental addition, arrive at a state where the cumulative burden of compliance functions as a de facto barrier to entry protecting established institutional incumbents from competition, while the system continues to be described, accurately with respect to its origins and inaccurately with respect to its current function, as consumer protection. This drift is rarely visible from within any single bureaucratic episode, examined in isolation. It becomes visible only across the accumulated pattern, which is, again, exactly the kind of reconstruction this book has identified as the natural specialty of a sufficiently patient forensic intelligence. Not judging any single regulation by its stated purpose, but tracing the actual cumulative effect of the entire accumulated system against the population required to navigate it, and asking whether that population retained, throughout, the genuine sovereignty the bureaucratic ritual claimed, at every individual step to be respecting. The next chapter turns to bureaucracy's most consequential historical application: colonial administration, where the procedural apparatus examined in this chapter was deployed not merely to manage an already governed population but to manufacture the legal appearance that an entire civilization's subjugation had been conducted with its consent, producing, across centuries of colonial paperwork, perhaps the starkest and most thoroughly documented case study available anywhere in history of bureaucracy functioning as ritual in exactly the sense this chapter has named. Chapter 14. Colonial Administration and Moral Paperwork. If the previous chapter argued that bureaucracy functions as ritual, generating the evidence of consent the underlying conditions did not actually permit, colonial administration supplies history's clearest and most exhaustively documented demonstration of the principle, because colonial powers, almost without exception, went to extraordinary lengths to produce exactly this evidence, even in circumstances where the underlying coercion was total, visible, and frequently backed by standing military force. This is worth sitting with before proceeding. A purely coercive system requires no paperwork. Conquest can simply be declared, administered by force, and left undefended in the vocabulary of consent. The fact that colonial powers, almost universally, did not choose the simpler path, that they instead invested enormous administrative, legal, and diplomatic effort into producing treaties, session documents, signed agreements, and a vast supporting literature of legal and moral justification, is itself the most important evidence this chapter can offer for the central argument of this book. Even total, force-backed domination apparently required the appearance of covenant. Power, even at its most naked, has rarely been satisfied with naked power alone. It has consistently sought the additional legitimacy that only the appearance of consent can supply, and it has been willing to invest enormous resources producing that appearance even when the underlying reality bore almost no resemblance to it. The treaty as the purest case study. Colonial treaties, the documents through which territory, sovereignty, or resource rights were formally ceded by indigenous parties to colonial powers, represent perhaps the purest available case study of the contract versus covenant collapse examined in Chapter 1, because the gap between the document's claimed conditions and its actual conditions is, in case after case, a matter of extensive historical record rather than inference. Apply Chapter 4's sovereignty test directly. The capacity to know was frequently absent in its most basic form. Treaties were often drafted in the colonizing power's language and legal tradition, presented to signatories operating under entirely different conceptual frameworks of land tenure, sovereignty, and obligation, with translation, where it occurred at all, performed by interpreters working for the colonizing party's interest. Numerous historically documented treaties involved indigenous signatories whose own understanding of what they were agreeing to, reconstructed from contemporaneous accounts and oral tradition, diverged sharply from the colonizing power's subsequent interpretation of the same document. Not a matter of one side misremembering, but of two parties operating from genuinely incommensurable frameworks, one of which controlled the only written record subsequently treated as authoritative. The capacity to refuse was frequently absent in an even starker form. Treaty negotiations routinely occurred in the immediate aftermath of military defeat, epidemic disease that had already devastated the negotiating population, or under the explicit or implicit threat of continued or resumed violence should negotiation fail. This is Chapter 2's vis et metus in its least diluted historical form, force and fear, named explicitly by Roman jurists as sufficient to void any agreement, present in colonial treaty-making not as a metaphor or structural abstraction but as an immediate, often recently demonstrated military reality standing directly behind the negotiating table. The capacity to be recognized fails most completely of all, in a manner this book has not yet fully named. Colonial legal doctrine frequently denied, as a matter of explicit legal principle, that indigenous societies possessed the kind of sovereignty capable of being violated or ceded in any meaningful sense to begin with. Doctrines along these lines, variously articulated across different colonial legal traditions, but converging on the conclusion that indigenous occupation did not constitute the kind of legal title European legal systems were prepared to recognize as equivalent to their own, performed a function this book examined directly in Chapter 4, declaring, in advance of any negotiation, that the other party's sovereignty was sufficiently absent or sufficiently lesser that the entire question of genuine consent became, within the colonizing power's own legal framework, largely moot. The treaty was not negotiated between two recognized sovereign parties. It was staged, using sovereignty's vocabulary, between a recognized party and one whose sovereignty had already been defined out of full legal existence. The doctrine of civilizational tutelage. Colonial administration developed its own version of the manufactured humility examined in Chapter 9, and developed it with remarkable explicitness, because colonial powers rarely felt the need to disguise the doctrine the way later, gentler institutions would learn to. The governing justification, articulated across multiple colonial traditions under various names, but converging on a common structure, held that colonized populations were not yet capable of the self-governance genuine sovereignty would require, and that colonial administration therefore served a temporary tutelary function, governing on behalf of a population not yet ready to govern itself, with the implicit or explicit promise that self-governance would be restored once the tutored population had achieved sufficient development by the colonizing power's own criteria. This is, structurally, identical to the proxy and guardianship mechanisms examined in Chapter 8, applied at the scale of entire civilizations rather than individual dependence, and it inherits the exact corruption Chapter 8 identified as proxy authority's characteristic drift. The criteria for sufficient development were set, administered, and judged exclusively by the same party whose continued authority depended on the criteria remaining unmet, producing a closed evaluative loop with no genuine mechanism for the represented party to contest its own continued classification as not yet ready. Colonial administrations, across multiple traditions and multiple centuries, demonstrated remarkable consistency in finding that the populations under their authority had not yet achieved readiness for self-governance, decade after decade, generation after generation, a consistency far better explained by Chapter 8's analysis of proxy authority's structural incentive to perpetuate itself than by any genuine, good faith assessment continuously updated as conditions changed. The civilizing mission as manufactured belief. Beyond the specific legal mechanisms of treaty and tutelage doctrine, colonial powers developed an extensive supporting literature, administrative reports, missionary accounts, academic ethnography, popular journalism, whose cumulative function was precisely the one Chapter 12 identified in wartime propaganda. Manufacturing, across the colonizing population itself, a sincere belief that colonial administration represented benevolent assistance rather than extraction and domination. This literature deserves particular attention because of who its primary audience actually was. It was directed less at the colonized population, who, after all, possessed direct experiential knowledge of colonial administration's actual character, than at the colonizing population back home, whose continued political and financial support for colonial enterprises depended on believing the enterprise served a civilizing rather than extractive function. This is Chapter 3's manufactured belief operating in a particularly consequential register. An entire domestic population recruited into sincere, self-defending conviction that an arrangement profiting their own nation at another population's direct expense was, in fact, a form of charity being extended downward rather than extraction being conducted outward. The durability of this belief across generations and despite extensive contemporaneous evidence available to anyone willing to examine it, illustrates Chapter 3's central claim about fraud superiority over force as a tool of domination. A domestic population that had been merely coerced into supporting colonial administration could, in principle, withdraw that support once coercion ended. A domestic population recruited into sincere belief in the enterprise's benevolence required no continued coercion at all. It defended the enterprise voluntarily, often for generations after the immediate economic interests driving the enterprise had been thoroughly documented and publicly available for examination. Independence and the incomplete reckoning. The collapse of formal colonial administration across the 20th century did not, this chapter must note honestly, constitute a full reckoning with the paperwork examined above. A great deal of the legal architecture, property arrangements, resource extraction agreements, administrative boundaries drawn without reference to the populations they divided, treaty terms whose original conditions were never genuinely revisited even after the immediate coercive context that produced them had formally ended, survived independence largely intact, inherited by successor governments who frequently found the inherited paperwork as useful for their own purposes as the colonial administrations that had originally produced it. This is, again, the pattern this book has identified repeatedly. An architecture of manufactured consent, once constructed, tends to outlast the specific conditions and even the specific institutions that originally constructed it, because the paperwork itself, the treaty, the boundary, the legal title, continues to function as evidence of legitimate agreement long after anyone capable of meaningfully examining the conditions under which it was produced has any institutional incentive to do so. What colonial administration demonstrates most clearly. This chapter closes Part 3's examination of the state's relationship to manufactured consent by naming what colonial administration demonstrates more starkly than any other case study available in recorded history. The appearance of consent has been valuable enough, to even the most overtly coercive institutions in human history, that those institutions were willing to invest staggering resources in manufacturing it, even under conditions where naked force would have been administratively simpler and required no comparable investment in legal fiction, treaty literature, or civilizing doctrine. This single fact should reorder how every subsequent chapter of this book is read. If even total military domination required the elaborate appearance of covenant, then the gentler, more diffused, less visibly coercive mechanisms examined throughout parts 1 through 3, structural economic duress, manufactured humility, bureaucratic ritual, tacit political consent, should be read not as milder versions of a fundamentally different phenomenon, but as more sophisticated, more economical refinements of the identical underlying project, extracting the value of consents. Legitimacy without paying the cost genuine consent actually requires. Part 3's final chapter turns to the one political mechanism explicitly designed, in theory, to solve this entire problem, democratic representation. The institution civilization has most confidently offered as proof that political consent can be genuinely and continuously secured rather than merely manufactured. Chapter 15 examines how thoroughly that promise has or has not been kept. Chapter 15. Democracy beyond elections. If colonial administration represents the starkest case study in manufactured political consent, democracy represents civilization's most confident counterclaim. The institution explicitly designed, in theory, to solve the entire problem this book has been tracing since Chapter 1. Democratic theory does not merely claim legitimacy through consent the way other political forms do. It claims a specific, continuously renewable mechanism for verifying that consent, the election, built precisely to satisfy Chapter 4's sovereignty test in a way tacit consent, hereditary authority, and colonial tutelage never could. This chapter takes that claim seriously because it deserves to be taken seriously. Democratic election, where genuinely competitive, genuinely informed, and genuinely free of coercion, comes closer to satisfying the covenant standard developed across this book than almost any other political mechanism in recorded history. The argument here is not that democracy is a fraud equivalent to colonial treaty-making. It is the narrower, more precise claim this book has applied to every institution examined so far. The mechanism's theoretical capacity to deliver genuine consent has been only partially realized in practice, and the gap between democratic theory and democratic practice has been filled, predictably, by exactly the mechanism's manufactured belief, structural duress, ritual without sovereignty, examined throughout this book. What the election was supposed to solve. The genius of the electoral mechanism, properly understood, is that it attempts to solve the deferred consent problem named in chapters 6 and 11, the infant who cannot consent to baptism, the citizen who cannot consent to the state they were born into, not by abandoning the requirement of consent but by relocating it to a moment that recurs continuously throughout adult life. A citizen born into a state without having consented to it is nonetheless asked, repeatedly at regular intervals, whether the specific governance currently exercising authority over them retains their endorsement. This is, structurally, the confirmation mechanism examined in Chapter 6, except designed to repeat indefinitely rather than occurring once, at a single vulnerable moment, never to be genuinely revisited again. This recurring structure is precisely what should, in theory, prevent democratic consent from suffering the embeddedness problem Chapter 7 identified in religious confirmation. A single ratification moment embedded in total social dependency fails the sovereignty test because refusal at that single moment carries catastrophic cost. A recurring ratification mechanism, available every few years, theoretically allows accumulated dissatisfaction to be expressed without requiring the citizen to sever every social and economic tie at once. They need only withdraw support from a specific governing party, not from the entire surrounding social fabric. This is a genuine structural advantage over every other consent mechanism examined in this book, and it deserves to be named as such before this chapter turns to where the advantage erodes in practice. Where the mechanism erodes. The erosion follows a familiar shape, because every component of the sovereignty test that the election is theoretically designed to satisfy turns out, on close examination, to be vulnerable to exactly the same mechanisms examined throughout this book. The capacity to know depends on an informed electorate, which depends in turn on an information environment genuinely capable of supplying accurate, comprehensive understanding of the choices on offer. Chapter 12 already examined how thoroughly that environment has been shaped, across more than a century of professionalized persuasion, by interests whose goal is not comprehensive understanding but favorable belief. An electorate operating within an information environment substantially shaped by manufactured consent, as Chapter 12 described it, cannot exercise the capacity to know in the form democratic theory requires, regardless of how procedurally clean the voting mechanism itself remains. The vote can be perfectly secret, perfectly counted, perfectly free of fraud in the narrow legal sense, and still fail to register genuine consent if the beliefs informing it were substantially manufactured before the citizen ever entered the polling place. The capacity to refuse depends on the menu of options actually presented to the voter bearing some genuine relationship to the full range of governance the population might, in principle, prefer. Democratic systems vary enormously in how genuinely open this menu is, from systems with low barriers to new party formation and competitive, well-resourced challenges to incumbent power, to systems where ballot access, campaign finance requirements, and media gatekeeping combine to narrow the realistic menu to a small number of options that, on the specific structural questions most threatening to concentrated existing power, frequently converge rather than diverge. Chapter 2's alternatives test applies here with full force. A choice between two pre-approved options is not equivalent to a genuinely open field of choice, even when the choice between the two options offered is itself completely free and uncoerced. The capacity to be recognized depends on the citizen's vote actually translating, with reasonable fidelity, into the governance outcome the aggregate of votes was intended to produce. This is where democratic systems vary most dramatically, and where the gap between procedural participation and substantive consent becomes sharpest. Electoral structures that produce governing outcomes substantially disconnected from the expressed preference of the electorate, through districting designed to predetermine outcomes regardless of vote totals, through unelected bodies retaining veto authority over elected decisions, through the influence of concentrated private resources on which candidates can realistically compete at all, produce exactly the recognition failure Chapter 4 identified as sovereignty's third and most fundamental requirement. A citizen whose vote does not meaningfully affect outcomes has not been denied the ritual of voting, only the substance the ritual was supposed to deliver. Voting as ritual. This is the point at which Chapter 7's framework becomes directly applicable to democratic practice, and the application is uncomfortable enough to be worth stating plainly. An election held under conditions where the information environment has been substantially shaped by manufactured belief, where the menu of options has been substantially narrowed by structural barriers, and where the translation of votes into governance has been substantially weakened by structural distortion, produces exactly what Chapter 7 identified as ritual without sovereignty, a ceremony generating the appearance and the emotional texture of consent, complete with civic pageantry, I voted stickers, and the genuine psychological satisfaction of having participated, without the underlying conditions necessarily having delivered the substantive consent the ceremony claims to register. This does not mean every election everywhere fails this test, any more than every confirmation or every contract examined in earlier chapters fails its corresponding test. It means the question of whether a given election satisfies the sovereignty test cannot be answered by examining the procedural cleanliness of the voting mechanism alone. Secret ballot, accurate count, absence of overt fraud, because procedural cleanliness, exactly as Chapter 1 argued about the contract signature, only confirms that a choice was registered, not that the conditions producing the choice were genuinely free. A perfectly counted vote, cast by a citizen whose beliefs were substantially manufactured, choosing among options substantially narrowed, in a system where the outcome substantially diverges from aggregate preference, is the electoral equivalent of the confirmation ceremony examined in Chapter 7. Real in its procedural details, hollow in the sovereignty it claims to register. Why democracy remains the strongest available mechanism. None of the above should be read as an argument that democracy is no better than the alternatives examined elsewhere in this book. It is considerably better for a specific and important reason. It is the only political mechanism examined across Part 3 that builds in a continuously available, structurally legitimate channel for the sovereignty test to actually be applied and reapplied, rather than foreclosing the question permanently at a single originating moment the way tacit consent, hereditary authority, and colonial tutelage all do. This matters for the argument the remainder of this book is building. A flawed mechanism with a built-in capacity for self-correction is categorically different from a flawed mechanism with no such capacity, even when both currently fall short of the sovereignty standard. Democracy's electoral structure, exactly because it depends on an informed electorate, an open menu, and faithful translation of preference into outcome, is also a mechanism uniquely well-positioned to be improved by exactly the kind of forensic transparency this book has argued artificial intelligence may eventually supply. Accurate, continuously updated information capable of cutting through manufactured belief. Transparent accounting of who actually benefits from ballot access and campaign, finance structures that narrow the menu, precise measurement of how faithfully governance outcomes track expressed preference, rather than diverging from it through structural distortion no individual voter can easily perceive on their own. This is the first point in this book where the eventual subject of Part 7 appears not merely as an auditor capable of exposing failure, but as a potential instrument of repair, not because artificial intelligence has any inherent democratic commitment, but because the specific failures democracy is vulnerable to are, more than any other institution examined in Part 3, failures of information asymmetry and structural opacity, precisely the failures a sufficiently capable and sufficiently independent forensic intelligence is best positioned to correct. Part 3 closes here, Having traced the state's relationship to manufactured consent from its philosophical foundations through its bureaucratic machinery, its starkest historical abuse, and its most promising, if still incomplete, corrective mechanism. Part 4 turns to a domain this book has referenced constantly but not yet examined directly, economics, and the specific architecture of debt, employment, housing, and credentialism through which structural duress, examined abstractly in Chapter 2, does its most pervasive and most underexamined daily work. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Or with fiat at paypal.me/MartinChartrand. Subscribe. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res text. Recent episodes. Under Duress Part 2. 1 hour ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Under Duress Part 1. 7 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The autonomous sovereign infrastructure.
In the ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
The autonomous sovereign
Structure Doctrine, a Pirate First Field Manual for the Parallel Boom Transition Zone. There will come a day when the sky is no longer free. That day is near, but the mesh is nearer. Preamble. This is. The question is not whether the sky will be governed. The question is whether the people beneath it will govern it or merely be governed by it. Sky moved the proposition into something mythological. The cenotes of the Yucatan were never merely geographical features. They were the mouths of Xibalba, the underworld's threshold. 2. Build an amphibious drone network that launches from their surfaces, that charges on algae-powered floating docks, that requires no roads and exerts no eminent domain over sacred land. This is infrastructure that follows the original geometry of the place. Skyfish-class drone. Logistics network modeled on the core philosophy of Bitcoin, applied to the physical world. The parallel is precise and should be memorized. Bitcoin nodes make the ledger incorruptible. Human hands make delivery redundant. Miners validate blocks. Carriers validate routes. BTC transactions cannot be censored. Trusted hand relays cannot be rerouted from outside. The only way to stop it is to shut down every node, every person, every hand. That is not an enforcement action. That is a war on the human capacity for mutual aid. Be doxed. Zero knowledge attestations verify that a handoff occurred without revealing who held what. End-to-end encryption means the hands along a relay chain only know the immediate next destination, not the origin, not the final goal. Operational security is baked into the protocol.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama. Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose. That direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata. In the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational of the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price.